Was Mary Boleyn the first Boleyn girl? Was she older than her famous sister Anne, who was the second wife of Henry VIII, and where did their brother George fit into the siblings' birth order? The timing of this famous trio's arrivals has eluded historians for centuries, so let's look at what we know about when Mary, Anne and George Boleyn were born, how old they would have been when they died, and why there is such a fierce argument about who was the most senior sibling. Way back at the start of my YouTube channel, in early 2021, I did a video about when Anne Boleyn was born, and since then I've been meaning to get back to the topic to look at when her sister Mary arrived too, and which of the siblings was older. It's taken a number of years, but here we are, and although Mary and Anne will be my main focus in this episode, make sure you stay till the end to hear me discuss their brother George's age as well, and why the evidence for his birth year is perhaps the most conflicting of all. Now, in that earlier video, I came to the conclusion that Anne was born in around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn, later Sir Thomas and later still the Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Howard. I'm not going to rehash everything I said there, but here's a summary of how I came to that conclusion, rather than agreeing with the other popular year of birth given for her, which is 1507. We don't know when Thomas and Elizabeth were married, but Elizabeth's jointure, the money assigned to support her in case she was widowed, was settled in mid-1501. One of Anne's biographers, Retha Warnicke, takes this as evidence that the marriage only occurred at that point, but another, Ives, says that this settlement suggests only that it had not taken place in the very distant past, likely no further back than 1498. It's up to you who you believe. If they were married no earlier than 1498, then that would make that year the earliest feasible for Anne's birth, and we know that the Boleyns started procreating fast and kept on doing so because Thomas would later recall that his wife had brought him every year a child at the start of their marriage, and we know at least two of their boys, called Henry and Thomas, did not survive childhood. In 1513, Anne was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen. The youngest age for a fille d'honneur, which is the position I believe she held, as does Ives, was about 12, and even if you think she was sent as a much younger child to complete her education in the schoolroom there and not work for Margaret, which is Retha Warnicke's take on the situation, a letter she wrote back to her father in England in that year, or possibly in 1514, which is in very broken French, looks like it was composed by a girl in her early teens, not a 6 or 7-year-old child. Google the phrase "a 6-year-old's handwriting" and you'll see that they simply don't write that small, let alone in their second language. And while Anne was undoubtedly very smart, no one ever suggested that she was an extraordinary genius. Her daughter Elizabeth was very bright too, and letters written by her when she was older than 6 still display less well-formed letters than those seen in Anne's missive. Anne also talks about becoming a woman of good reputation and uses big words like orthography, both of which indicate a maturity level far above that of a 6 or 7-year-old in my opinion. By the by, that letter was dated in a 1981 article by Hugh Paget, which I couldn't get a hold of to check myself, but Ives and the Oxford DNB say that Paget dated Anne's letter to 1513, while Warnicke says he dated it to 1514. They can't all be right, but the dates are so close to each other that it doesn't make a great deal of difference to the argument about her birth year. Anne left Margaret's court relatively quickly and transferred to that of Mary Tudor, the youngest sister of Henry VIII, who briefly became Queen of France in late 1514. Anne stayed on there in 1515 after Mary's widowhood, remarriage and departure from France to serve her successor, Queen Claude. Again, being a maid of honour to a queen consort is much more fitting for a girl in her mid-teens than a child of 7, and again, I don't buy into the idea that she was being sent all over Europe at such a young age just to attend different royal schoolrooms thanks to the connections of her ambassador father Thomas. There are other reasons to think she was born in around 1501 though. Had she only been about 28 at the time of her execution on the 19th of May 1536, it would have been strange for King Henry to dump her for his third wife, Jane Seymour, who was only born in around 1508 in the hope of getting a son, especially as Anne had been pregnant as recently as January 1536. If she was in her mid-30s, it makes more sense. Why is 1507 still such a popular year given for her birth then? The answer lies primarily in 3 comments, none of which date to Anne's lifetime or even to the 16th century. Before I reveal what they are though, please remember to hype, like and comment on this video as it really helps me out and is a great totally free way to support the channel. You can also join as a channel member for members only posts and badges next to your name in the comments, or find me at patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonuses every week like early access to ad-free videos and patron-only podcasts. It's also just a really nice little community that we've got going on over there. There's also my free mailing list, which will get you my newsletter and 2 complimentary downloads, and which you can join on my website, historycallingofficial.com. The first source indicating a birth year of 1507 for Anne is an early 17th century biography of a lady by the name of Jane Dormer, which says that Anne was not 29 years of age at the time of her death in the Tower of London, leading some to assume that Anne would have turned 29 slightly later in 1536. Jane was only born in 1538 though, and while she later worked as a lady-in-waiting to Anne's stepdaughter, Mary I, there's actually no evidence as to where she got this information from, nor would I automatically assume that Mary I would have known her hated stepmother's exact birthday and passed that detail on to Jane. Jane also didn't even write her memoirs herself. She talked about her life decades later, long after she'd left England and become the Duchess of Feria, with a man called Henry Clifford. He then wrote up the book about her. She could easily have made a mistake about Anne's age, given how much time had passed though, and it's interesting to note that a description of her being not quite 29 at the time of her death could also be applied to Jane Seymour, who died in October 1537, or Clifford could have misunderstood what she said. Thus, this is not a great source. The second source supporting a 1507 birth year is in William Camden's 1615 book Annales Rerum Anglicarum et Hibernicarum Regnante Elizabetha. Again, this is a much later publication written by someone who didn't know Anne, but Camden did have access to the archives of William Cecil, Baron Burghley, one of Elizabeth I's great favourites, so his information may be more trustworthy than Jane Dormer's, though we don't actually know how he came up with this year. Finally, we have John Weaver, who wrote in 1631 in his Ancient Funeral Monuments that Anne was 16 years younger than Henry, who we know was born in 1491. Weaver could have been copying information sourced from Dormer or Camden, however, so I see no reason to give him any particular credence as an independent source. Thus, I don't think the 3 17th century sources are particularly credible, as none of them tell us exactly where they were getting their information about Anne's date of birth, none were written by people who knew her, and I think they are outweighed by Anne's early career in Mechelen and France and her 1513 or 1514 letter to her father. If there were stories floating around that she was born in 1507, which were later picked up by Dormer and Camden, I think they could also be attributed to Anne lying about her age in later life to make herself appear as a younger, more suitable bride for Henry VIII and more likely to be able to give him children. Retha Warnicke thinks that if she was born in circa 1501, it's strange no one commented on her age when she gave birth to Elizabeth I in 1533. But if Anne was spreading lies about when she was born, that might account for that too. Warnicke also points to a comment made by Anne's father in a 1514 letter to Margaret of Austria, in which he called his daughter La Petite Boleyn, meaning the little Boleyn, saying that this indicates she was still a little girl, but it could equally indicate that she was small in stature, his younger daughter, more on that point a little later, or it might have just been a pet name. Lastly, there are a couple of sources which actually support my argument that she was born in about 1500 or 1501, but which I don't nevertheless give much credit to. An English Catholic recusant living in exile in the 1580s named Nicholas Sander or Sanders, who was only a child when Anne died and who hated her daughter, described her, Anne, as being 15 when she went to France, which we know occurred in late 1514. However, his account of her life, which was published posthumously in 1585, is absolutely riddled with lies and/or errors. He didn't know she'd been in Mechelen first, for instance. He claimed with no evidence cited that she'd had an affair with her father's butler and chaplain, and he said she had 6 fingers on one hand and various other disfigurements. The only thing he has going for him is that he was writing several decades closer to Anne's lifetime than Dormer, Camden and Weaver. To hear more about his claims regarding Anne's physique, by the way, see my video all about that supposed extra finger, which I'll leave linked for you. In 1649, another posthumous book was published, this time written by Edward Herbert, Baron Cherbury. In it, we see a few sentences which begin by saying that Anne was still at the French court in 1520. The year appears next to the main text in a marginal note. Then he goes on to say that, "At last, being come hither," meaning having arrived back in England, "and about the 20th year of her age, received into our Queen's service." This seems to suggest that Anne was about 20 when she returned home, which we know was in late 1521 or the very start of 1522. Yet Camden, who Cherbury cites in another marginal note as being the source of his information, said she was only born in 1507, and so would have only been about 14 at the time she came back to England. Herbert's writing style is a bit murky in this passage, but what he actually seems to be saying is that Anne returned from the continent, and then, sometime later, when she was about 20, she joined the household of the then Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon. So when did she enter the Queen's service, I hear you ask? As with so much of Anne's life, there is no precise date here, but we can get pretty close to one. She was present at a court pageant in March 1522, for instance, where she played the role of Lady Perseverance, and her involvement with a man called Henry Percy, which Cherbury goes on to discuss immediately afterwards, apparently took place during her time with Catherine. As this relationship was certainly over by the end of 1523, because Percy was married to a woman by the name of Mary Talbot in March 1524, Herbert is therefore saying that Anne was around 20, no later than 1523, all the while citing Camden, who says she would have been no more than 16 at this point. So Herbert's confusing work can be used to argue either side of the debate, especially as the phrase "about the 20th year of her age" indicates a margin of error of a couple of years, and I hope you can see why I don't base my belief that she was born in around 1501 on what he says. To hear about the evidence surrounding when she was born in more detail, make sure to watch my original video about the mystery surrounding her date of birth. It's linked on screen and below for you. So much for Anne. What do we know about Mary's birth, and crucially, where it fits into the timeline in relation to Anne's arrival? As with her sister, there is no definitive piece of evidence which tells us when Mary was born, and instead we have to make some educated guesses based on other events in her life. Again, if we don't think her parents were married earlier than 1498, then that gives us an earliest possible year for her birth, if they married at the start of the year and Elizabeth Howard became pregnant immediately. We also know that she went to France with Mary Tudor as a lady-in-waiting in late 1514, and as I've told you, the minimum age for such a role was typically 12, putting her birth year no later than 1502. She married for the first time on the 4th of February 1520 to William Carey. As the minimum age for marriage and cohabitation for a girl in this era was also 12, this indicates she was born no later than February 1508, but it was unusual for girls not drawn from royalty or the upper echelons of the aristocracy to be married off that young, and I suspect that she was several years older than 12 when she became a wife. She was the mistress of Henry VIII at some point too in the late 1510s or early 1520s, and though Henry was known to have teenage mistresses on occasion, Bessie Blunt and Catherine Howard for instance, there's no indication that he was interested in girls of only 13 or 14. Furthermore, Mary was later described as having been a wanton woman during her time in France, and it is hard to believe that she wasn't at least in her mid-teens for this to be true. The idea that she was significantly younger is not only gross, it goes against even the far more lax laws of the time, which, as I've said, allowed for a consummated marriage of a girl at the age of 12. Yes, the accusations may have just been a slander against her, but as she did go on to sleep with Henry VIII, it doesn't seem out of character for her. I therefore think the date range for Mary's birth can be placed between 1498 and 1502, probably at the earlier end of that spectrum in about 1499, making her 15 when she was in France and about 20 or 21 when she was first married. Was she older or younger than Anne, though? Again, let's look at her early career as it compared to her sisters and see what we think. Warnicke argues that Mary was younger because Anne was given the opportunity to go to Mechelen in 1513, not her, and this privilege would surely have gone to the older sister. As she thinks Anne was born in 1507, she puts Mary's birth in 1508, meaning that Mary would have been a child when she was supposedly leading a wanton life in France, a barely 12-year-old bride in 1520, and at most in her early to mid-teens when she was Henry's mistress, if we assume that relationship, which actually could have just been a one-night stand for all we know, was in the early 1520s. To me, this chronology just doesn't make sense, and I find it far easier to believe that Anne was the younger sister and was sent to Mechelen because she was academically brighter and her parents thought she'd get more out of the opportunity, or perhaps she had a temperament which it was felt would be better suited to life at Margaret of Austria's court. If the stories about Mary's behaviour at the French court are anything to go by, and her later conduct with King Henry, maybe her parents also didn't trust her to behave herself in a ladylike manner in 1513, but thought, inaccurately, that she'd matured a bit when they let her go to France in late 1514. Honestly, there are all sorts of reasons why Anne might have been chosen to go over her sister. Maybe Mary simply didn't want to leave England in 1513. Maybe she was in poor health. As Ives points out, she was also brought home from France years before Anne and launched at the English court. In addition, she was married in 1520, nearly 2 years before any serious discussion about Anne's possible marriage prospects. There was initially a plan to wed this future queen to her cousin, the Irishman James Butler. Both pieces of evidence suggest that Mary was the older sister. I've already explained that Thomas Boleyn's comment to Margaret of Austria, calling Anne the little Boleyn, might be an indication that she was his younger daughter, but the closest we get to a slam-dunk confirmation that Mary was indeed the elder comes courtesy of a piece of evidence dating to October 1597. This is a letter written by her grandson Lord Hunsdon to Lord Burleigh, suggesting that he should be allowed to have the earldom of Ormond on the basis that he was the senior surviving descendant of Thomas Boleyn. In other words, because Mary and Anne's brother George Boleyn had had no children, Hunsdon was saying that he should have the earldom because he was the descendant of Thomas's elder surviving daughter. Ives argued, and I agree, that Hunsdon would have had to be very sure of his information before asking to have this earldom over the claims of the Queen herself, who would have been Thomas Boleyn's senior descendant if her mother Anne was the elder daughter. Mind you, he didn't get that earldom, and the tomb of his own granddaughter, Lady Elizabeth Berkeley, states that she was the descendant of Thomas Boleyn's second daughter, Mary. This might suggest that family lore had changed in the decades since Hunsdon wrote to Burleigh, or that the engraver made a mistake. It's certainly worth noting that the inscription gets the year of Lady Berkeley's death wrong, ascribing it to 1633 instead of 1635, so I have no trouble believing it got her genealogy wrong too. Thus, despite some contradictions in the evidence, I remain in the 1501 camp, due to my opinion of how old Anne was when she wrote the letter to her father in 1513 or 1514. You can let me know what you think in the comments, but my personal take on this whole debate is that Mary was born before Anne, probably in about 1499, which is the year Jonathan Hughes gives as well in her entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. This would have made her about 44 years of age when she died in 1543. You're certainly not crazy though if you think Anne was born in 1507 and/or was the elder sister. The sources are very conflicting, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on them in the comments. Let's finish up with George Boleyn. I have no pictures of him, I'm afraid, so we can't see how much he resembled his sisters, but I'll leave linked for you my video all about why a supposed Holbein sketch of him actually isn't Queen Anne's brother, and why a portrait labelled as being the Earl of Ormond isn't their father. Again, his parents' marriage being in about 1498 gives us an earliest possible date for his birth, but beyond that there's very little to go on. He was married to Jane Parker in 1525, or maybe very early 1526, indicating he was at least 14 by that point, the youngest permissible age for a boy to marry and cohabit with his wife, and giving us a latest birth year of 1512, but other evidence is contradictory and hard to interpret. Ives notes that he took part in the court Christmas celebrations in 1514 into 1515 and was evidently only a child at that point. Plus, he only received his first royal grant in July 1524, which was the manor of Grimston in Norfolk. Both things suggest relative youth, and that he was younger than his sisters, who were in their 20s by 1524, with Mary a married woman of 4 years' standing. However, part of a poem by his contemporary, George Cavendish, who worked in the household of Henry VIII's then chief minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, in the 1520s, muddies the waters. It's quite long, but the relevant section of it reads as follows. It hath not been known nor seldom seen that any of my years before this day into the privy council preferred hath been. My sovereign lord in his chamber did me assay, or years thrice 9 my life had passed away. A rare thing sure seldom or never heard, so young a man so highly to be preferred. These lines indicate that George was a member of the King's Privy Chamber when years thrice 9 my life had passed away, meaning when he was 27. He lost this position in January 1526, which would mean that he was born no later than 1499, or more likely 1498, which is right at the edge of what is possible given his parents' assumed marriage year. In fact, it would place his birth before Retha Warnicke thinks they were married, and I can guarantee you that he wasn't illegitimate, as that absolutely would have been known at court and commented upon. It would also conflict with the presumed birth year of his sister Mary, and before anyone suggests it, no, these two weren't twins. Furthermore, if the poem is taken to indicate that he was 27 when he took up that position, possibly several years earlier, then that would push his birth back even further, beyond even Eric Ives' guess about his parents' assumed earliest year of marriage. In any case, it would certainly render him the eldest of the Boleyn siblings. So what are we to make of all this? Because we've now gone through all the scanty evidence we have for this man's age. Well, Ives points out that George Cavendish wrote his poem about George Boleyn 30 years after the events he was describing. It appeared in his book The Life of Cardinal Wolsey, which was most likely written in the mid to late 1550s, and he may have made a genuine mistake about Boleyn's age thanks to how much time had passed. He, Ives, also says that, quote, since the dictates of the verse made the next lowest number years thrice 8, he may have been trying to say no more than about 25, thus indicating a birth date of about 1500. It gets more complicated, though, when we consider the rest of George's career, as Ives goes on to explain. On the other hand, after losing his post in 1525, which might have been very early 1526, the loss of the post was actually confirmed in January 1526, George was restored to a full adult place in the Privy Chamber by the end of 1529, and it could be this that Cavendish had in mind. In that case, or thrice 9 would, taken strictly, indicate a date of 1503 to 4, while about 25 would give 1504 to 5. What perhaps should clinch the acceptance of this last is a remark by Jean de Belay in 1529. Du Bellay was a French diplomat working at the English court in this period, suggesting that he thought George too young to be sent as ambassador to France. A date of circa 1504 is the most widely accepted for George's birth, making him about 5 years younger than his sister Mary and about 3 or 4 years younger than Anne. This would mean that he was around 32 when he was executed on Tower Hill in 1536, just days before Anne was killed too, having been accused of incest with her. Viscount Rochford, as he had by then become, is buried next to his sister in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in the Tower's grounds. His wife, Jane Parker Boleyn, and he and Anne's first cousin, Queen Catherine Howard, joined them there in February 1542, having also fallen foul of Henry VIII's mercurial temper. That brings us to the end of this study of when Mary, Anne and George Boleyn were born. I hope your family tree isn't as murky as theirs, but if you have Irish ancestry and would like to learn more about your forebears, hopefully including solid dates of birth for them, then you might like to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available at Amazon as both an ebook and a paperback, and linked in the description box and pinned comment for you. Just before I go, I'd also like to say a quick thank you to all those who support the channel using the super thanks button under videos. It's much appreciated. Let me know in the comments if you think Mary or Anne was the elder sister, and to learn more about this infamous family, watch one of these videos next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.